Okay, welcome everyone. Thank you for joining Systems Thinking Ontario meeting number, I'm going to check, 118. And this session is titled, What Can Systems Thinkers Learn from an Evaluation Mindset, with Tara and Campbell, who will introduce themselves shortly. But firstly, as is usual in our style of fashion, we just want to go around the virtual room and have folks introduce themselves. About what brought you to systems thinking and what may or may you not know about an evaluation mindset. So I'll just name off some folks in the gallery view. I'll just go through it. And so when I call your name, you can unmute, introduce yourself just very briefly, and then we'll go on to the next. Dawn Officer.
Okay, there we go. Unmuted. Okay. I guess I've been interested in systems theory for a long time because I noticed how many people were involved in what you might call they were locked into a transactional mindset, couldn't see or didn't care to see consequences down the road. You can see a lot of that in the way things are going these days, where there are a lot of issues that really shouldn't have ever cropped up. But I couldn't get consensus on how to move forward or how to think systemically by any particular set of criteria, and there we are. Evaluation, I have a more negative approach feeling about because I've seen it misused so often. And I often think people measure a lot of things that would be best left alone because it's a waste of time. On the other hand, obviously there are some measures that are really important to evaluate. I'm just wondering how you evaluate evaluation. I'll leave it
Awesome.
at that.
Don, it sounds like your mic, just for later on, it sounds like your mic's hitting something, but I'll mute you for now. Later on, when you get to the Q&A, we can unmute and sort it out.
There's an issue with the mic, you said?
Yeah,
okay.
But I'll mute you for now and just go through the rest.
Okay.
Next up is Griff.
Wow, so early. Next, hey everybody, I'm Griff. Nice to meet you all. A PhD candidate at the University of Waterloo. I'm closely involved with the Creative Commons, and I came to systems thinking maybe 5 or more years ago. I think it might have been through Tara, now that I'm thinking about it. No, around the same time that I met Tara. I had the pleasure of meeting Systems Thinking Ontario, and now I do a little bit of work with both Tara and Cam, so really happy to see you folks tonight. And that's it.
Thanks, Griff. Next up is David Hawk.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Good. Okay, I guess the distinction that I rely on is that I've noticed that analysis is particularly good if you're dealing with dead things or you like to prepare to kill them off. It seems like a very good approach. At least it gives you a badge of honor in many circles. Whereas if you want to deal with live things that are moving and in essence often very unfaithful because they keep moving, I'm afraid you'll have to take the systems approach. And that's a tough one. And I've been there since at least 75, possibly even 70. I'm not quite sure. I'd have to go do the analysis on all that dead stuff to figure out when I started. And I tend not to do that. And I'm here in this group mainly because of David Ng and friends. They keep reminding me that a few people in the world care about systems. And so I like to see such people. There's little rays of hope. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Next up on the grid is Nishat.
Yeah, thanks. Well, I'm Nishat, and I don't really have a lot to say. I think I was introduced to systems thinking and general systems theory as well. I think in David Hawk's lectures in my undergrad years, and came across like a lot of very useful authors, and David Ng is, of course, and actually almost everything I've learned about systems thinking or systems theory is to be found on David Ng's blog, coevolving.com, as well as the Mattermost open learning's common. So if you guys are interested, I guess you can find everything listed in there. That's about from me.
Cool. Thanks, Nishat. Next up, it looks like it's like a daily double on Jeopardy, Francesca, because there's two people.
Daily double. Hi, my name is Francisca. I'm a consultant for educational startups, and so very curious today to hear how, evaluation might help me improve my own services to startups. I've come across systems thinking in my uni days 12, 13 years ago, studying a lot of Niklas Luhmann. And it's evolved ever since. I'm still here and interested.
I'm Sean Patrick. I did not come at systems thinking through an academic background. I worked for Greenpeace, and we use systems thinking in our campaign design. I didn't do any of the readings, but I'm very interested to see how it's used in evaluation. Over.
Awesome. Thank you. Next up, Kelly Okamura.
Ah, am I in mute? No, I guess I'm not. I'm Kelly Okamura. I'm based in Toronto. I came to systems through design thinking from Peter Jones, and I'm really grateful to all of my systems mentors that have helped me learn organically. I'm certainly not coming from academics, but hopefully I'm contributing towards being part of the systems changes learning team.
Awesome. Thanks, Kelly. Next, Aisha.
Hi, I'm a grad student at OCAD in the SFI program, MDes SFI. So that's how I'm involved with Systems Thinking Ontario through Peter Jones. I worked on several research projects where I was part of the evaluation team. I've also had experience on quality assurance during my time as a professor. And I recently worked on a mindfulness project where I was also involved with the evaluation component. So that's my experience.
Awesome. Thank you. Elena.
Hi, I'm Elena Leonard in Toronto, and I was introduced to systems thinking way back when I was a doctoral student at the University of Maryland studying with Barry Clemson, who was at that point the president of the American Society for Cybernetics. I thought it explained how the world works, and I've been here ever since.
Thanks, Elena. Next up, if I get the pronunciation right, Michelle.
Did you say Michelle?
Michelle, or is it McKelly? I've heard of
It's Michelle.
Okay.
It's Michelle. I just wanted to make sure that it was my turn. Hello, everyone. My name is Michelle Battle Fisher, she, her pronouns, and I am presently the Associate Director of Research for Equitas Health Institute in the United States. I'm also an adjunct faculty at Temple University in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. My introduction to systems came in 2012. I'm telling my age. I was a part of a training with the U.S. NIH, National Institutes of Health. They were interested in social, kind of like systems thinking, system science, and health. My background is public health, and I'm working LGBTQIA+, HIV, and BIPOC health, Black, Indigenous, people of color. So everything that I think about in public health is systems related, which puts me sometimes in opposition to my comrades in public health. So anything that I can come across in systems thinking in health or systems thinking and methodology, I am there. Thank you very much.
Thank you for joining. Amy is next.
Hi, everyone. Sorry, I'm just off camera because I'm home with my son, and so he'll be coming in and out. But I'm Amy Morell, she, her. I am currently Associate Vice President of Institutional Effectiveness at Centennial College, and I got exposed to systems thinking when I did the SFI program a few years ago, which I've graduated from, and obviously through Peter Jones, which seems to be the common connection point here. Systems thinking was actually my favorite class, and it's something that I'm trying to figure out how to bring and introduce into the operations at the college, and having people understand that it is a system and how everything is connected, because I've not been able to find much research on that to date. And so in terms of measurement, I oversee our data analytics team, research office, and strategy, planning, and governance. And so measurement is obviously a really key piece of that. And I find a lot of these things are a little bit less tangible, and particularly in the current world that we're living in around, you know, measuring when there are requests to be more inclusive of Indigenous ways of knowing, and how do you set objectives and how do you measure and whatnot. So I'm really interested to hear how this conversation evolves. I may not have much to contribute, but I'm really interested to listen. So thank you for having me.
Yeah, welcome. Fourth last introduction, David Ng.
Hi, David Ng. Yes, so a regular organizer of this. Cameron and I usually meet on the bench at the end of my street, so it's nice to actually see him online, because the weather gets cold in the winter. Not for now.
Thanks, David. And I'm host. I didn't introduce myself fully, but my name is Khan. I'm also a graduate of the SFI program. So I came to systems thinking through SFI and Peter Jones as well. And I'm really interested in a variety of topics. So I've been helping co-organize these meetings about what we can learn from other topics or fields. So to that end, I want to welcome Tara and Cameron. Cam, as part of this conversation about what can systems thinkers learn from an evaluation mindset. And so what I'll do to kick us off, Tara and Cam, is I'll ask you each to introduce yourselves, but in that introduction, you can maybe start to uncover a response to the question of, what does an evaluation mindset mean to you? Tara.
Hi, everyone. Yeah, my name is Tara Campbell. I use she, her pronouns, and I'm joining from Edmonton, Treaty 6 territory today. But I also have some, I guess, overlapping origins with connections to these topics in this group. I did my master's in the SFI program, the Strategic Foresight and Innovation program at OCAD, as many others have, and did my master's research project with Peter Jones. So that's kind of some of my initial connection into the systems thinking world. And I came to that program through a deep kind of orientation and interest in societal transition. I was really kind of fascinated by the transition design work coming out of Carnegie Mellon around that time, and was looking for a place where I could maybe explore stuff like that a little bit more. And that's kind of, transition design is maybe a little bit less of my orientation these days, but it's still that like idea about transition and kind of like a deep desire for other worlds, and a deep acknowledgement that transitions in our modern ways of living are needed and on the horizon is sort of like, I think, very core in my work following the program. And I've been, so I'm thinking about what design looks like in service of transition. And that's sort of, yeah, that kind of motivated my master's research project, where I learned about evaluation for the first time. I was playing around with principles-focused evaluation as a way of evaluating my own design practice and whether it might be in service of transition or not. But yeah, I wouldn't say that I'm definitely not a professional evaluator like Cam, and I have a little bit, I would say I mostly have questions about evaluation. I think it's really interesting when it gets applied in a systems context where, yeah, I feel like the idea that like things that you do and impact in a system are kind of, it's like very hard to attribute what you're seeing in the world to the things that you're doing. And so I have questions about how do we make decisions around what we do in terms of what is kind of opening up pathways for change and what's not. I don't think these are things that we can answer very easily, but that's a question that I have. And I'm kind of coming at that right now professionally as, yeah, I work at the David Suzuki Foundation, which is an environmental NGO here in Canada. And I work on a program that's about economic transition. And so I'm asking, like, the economy is such a massive, complex system, and I'm working on a program that has like ambitions to transform it. And so I think these are, yeah, these questions about like, how do I orient myself? How do I choose what to do? How do I kind of figure out what our program should be working on? And how do I judge whether what we're doing are doing things that we want them to be doing? I think these are the kinds of questions that I have, and I don't necessarily have good answers for them, but that's sort of what brings me into evaluation. And I think going back to your question about what is an evaluation mindset, I think, yeah, I think Cam can kind of talk a little bit maybe about more about the distinctions between like capital E evaluation and lowercase e evaluation. But to me, it's like in a very simple sense, kind of around passing judgment around whether something is effective or not. And that's like, to me, the very like straightforward kind of idea about what evaluative thinking is doing. I think there's a lot of nuances around what that can mean. Like, what does it mean to pass judgment? How do we do that? But ultimately, it is to judge whether something is effective or not. So I think I'll leave it there and pass it to Cam.
Excellent. Yeah. Thank you, Tara. Yeah, Cam, why don't you share a bit about where you're coming to? And Tara's left a lot of wonderful starting points on the table to respond to as well.
Yes, sure have, Tara. That's a great great introduction. And pleasure to see people and meet people. My name's Cameron Norman, and I was absolutely I came to systems thinking by a wonderful accident of opportunity, and I happened to study psychology, so my background is originally in psychology. My Psych 100 class, I took a course from Dr. Paul Antrobus at the University of Regina, and the very first thing he did was show us The Powers of 10 by Charles and Ray Eames. Now, anybody who studied psychology knows that that's probably not the first thing you'd be expecting when you're taking Psych 100. You're sort of expecting Freud or rats or something like that. And like he basically showed the video and said, this is the domain of psychology. Let's get to it. And my mind was blown. I immediately said, not only do I like psychology, this is the kind of psychology that I want to study. And strangely enough, of course, came to realize that that wasn't how most people learned psychology. So, but that was an interesting thing. And but Paul was an interesting guy. I am a profoundly interesting guy. And one of the things that he was also very conscious of is that when you are working in psychology, you're working with people's lives in a sense. You're helping them learn, you're helping them grow, you're helping them repair and helping them heal. And he was incredibly wise, and he was also very respectful of the field and understand we can do a lot of damage by what we do. So we need to know what we're doing and what kind of influence we're having. And to what extent, what impact. So he was the first person that not only instructed me about systems thinking, but also about evaluation. And again, when you don't know anything different, you kind of think, well, that's just how everybody thinks. And then you realize as you go through your degrees and stuff like that, not everybody does. So I do want to say, Michelle, I heard your introduction. We may have crossed paths in some other ways because I got to intentionally connect the two. I'd studied evaluation, I'd studied behavior change and that. But I did a postdoctoral fellowship with Dr. Alan Best, who was working with the NIH in the United States and the NCIC here in Canada, the National Cancer Institutes, and on an initiative that eventually became a manuscript that if any of you haven't seen it, it's a phenomenally ambitious project. It was called Greater Than the Sum. And what they did is they brought systems thinkers from a variety of different disciplines together with evaluators and behavioral scientists. And they said, well, what if we all took a look at the concept of cancer, prevention, control, and that stuff, like what might we learn from each other? And there was a whole long initiative around that. And I was thrilled to be a part of that. So I also have lots of connections, I think, as we all do, to Peter Jones. Peter and I taught together at OCAD for a few years. I also am a graduate of the SFI program. So, I mean, we're pretty much as wrapped together as we can be. But I do professional evaluation. I've been doing that for many years. But obviously, I've got a systems approach lens towards the work I do. As a consultant, I've had a company called Sense, and I work right now for a company called Blueprint that does work with nonprofits, across Canada. So the question is, what does an evaluation mindset mean to me? To me, it's a place of homecoming, because that's kind of where I started. Again, not realizing that that's how things, how I was trained, but to me, I think we do have a responsibility, particularly when we talk about systems. Systems are the great levers we have. If collectively we're going to work on creating change, when you study psychology, you realize the inverse, the pyramid, is that the smallest point of influence is really changing individuals. The greatest point of leverage is really changing systems, and yet we flip it upside down. Most of psychology talks about changing individuals. But I think there's also a responsibility to understand what it is that we do by trying to change systems, and both from a curiosity standpoint, but certainly from an ethical standpoint. And an evaluation mindset is a way to help ask questions of, what does what I make produce in the world? How does it affect people? How does it affect systems? So that's really what an evaluation mindset is for me.
Awesome. That was really helpful, really rich background that both of you shared. Tara, in your aspect of it, you were describing some almost questions, potentially even critical questions. I was wondering, do you, in terms of just making this discussion, do you want to pose some of those to Cam, and then we can all kind of join in?
Yeah, I don't want to critique the field of evaluation necessarily, because I feel like I'm not actually engaging with it all that much. But I do think that, I think that how we evaluate, I think it's actually maybe more of a critique of like systems change and social innovation work in general that I think doesn't engage with these questions of like, what are our theories about what we're doing, and can we judge those theories? How do we like think about potentially unintended consequences of our work? How do we judge whether we're opening up pathways for the kinds of futures we want? So I think like it's actually more of a critique of the field that I come from, in the sense that I think that there's we don't really have a good way of evaluating these questions. And I think, I'm not sure, there's probably stuff that the evaluation field can offer. I think the systems world also has a lot to offer, but I think, the questions that come up for me sort of come through all the different phases of like a design cycle in a sense. Like I think there's a lot of things that like every stage can be evaluated to an extent. I think I have questions about how do I, if I'm kind of motivated by a vision, how do I evaluate whether that is a good vision to have? Is that a motivating vision? Is it something that is like a good place for me to be working towards? I think that's a question I have around evaluation. I always have questions about, like, my work is always guided by either implicit or explicit theories of how the world works and how change happens. And I think those are guiding whatever it is that I choose to do through my work. And I think that's, again, a place that I always need to come back to and evaluate. Like, are those good theories? Are these models of change good models of change? And then again, kind of having an ability to evaluate like where I am at, or where the world is at, and like what opportunities exist. Like I think everything's always moving, so there's always a need to be evaluating like what makes sense at the given moment. So those are kind of, I guess, the spaces where I have evaluative questions coming up, which is kind of all the time. That's why it's evaluative thinking. It's intertwined with like design thinking or systems thinking. And yeah, I am very curious about what it means to do that, and what it means to like try to answer these questions when you're thinking through a lens of complexity and systems. How do you judge whether something you're doing is opening up a pathway for a certain type of future or not? I think that the way that we're working in systems is often for, like, we're never actually going after that like North Star or that vision. Like that's not something that we can design. We're designing for I guess emergence in a way, where like what are the things that we can try to create that make that more possible, make a transition more possible. But being able to judge that and discern, I think, is very difficult. So those are the questions that I think about a lot.
And one thing you mentioned, Tara, that I thought was interesting, and maybe Cam, you can respond to these questions in the context of the questions that Tara is asking. What does the capital E field of evaluation offer in response to those questions versus the small case E mindset or approach or attitude enable or help rethink through? Maybe that's a good clarification that we can start from.
Some great questions, big questions there, and I'm looking forward to discussing all of these as a group. So what I would say is, Zad, to your point about the capital E and small e, and I think just like systems thinking, and I'll just speak from my perspective, is I see it as a field. Like it's a field of methods and tools and approaches and ways of approaching problems, and you can dive very deep into a specific kind of theory or model or approach, and those things are, or you can take a more kind of a more softer focus on it, and ultimately it comes down to what's got some utility for what you're looking to do. Evaluation is very much the same way. I think the joke, as I said, we were chatting in advance of this, is that I often will say that evaluation is the longest four-letter word in the English language, because most people, outside of people that maybe do it professionally, that's not usually an attractive term, because it's often done to them. Somebody is rendering a judgment on your performance, or your, the merits of what you're doing, the qualities, the worth, that kind of stuff. And people don't like having that done to them. Now, you can do it with people, but at the same time is that there's also this idea about, like, to what standard are we talking about? But to make that distinction between the capital E and the small e, so capital E evaluation is a field. It's got a bunch of methods and tools and approaches and things like that. But ultimately, the way, and my approach, and I'll tell you, it's not, maybe it's, I don't know how common it is. I'll let everybody else make the assessment how common it is, but I tend to be relatively agnostic. I have an approach to tackling problems because I find them to be more useful. But I'm not as worried about, whether using a quantitative or qualitative approach, whether you're using something that's, there's a myriad different types out there. It's mostly, are you asking the right question for the right thing? Like much like design, as Tara was talking about, it's how can you create something that's fit for purpose? So how good is the fit and what is your purpose? And so that's kind of how I approach things. That's the small, like asking questions about what's happening here. Can I draw some kind of connection between the activities that I'm involved in or we're involved in and what they're generating in terms of new patterns of activity? Are they, and we can talk about outcomes, we can talk about that kind of stuff like that, but it's really about asking those kinds of questions. That's the small E, which in many ways is the bigger E, as I often think about it. But it's really coming down to the idea of but what makes evaluation what it is systematic. Like you're not just arbitrarily asking things and using whatever it is you have available. It's again that fit for purpose. Like a great evaluation has got a strong fit for a clear purpose. And of course, there's lots of methods and tools, and you can use measurement, you can use observation, you can do all kinds of things like that. And there's benefits and drawbacks to each one of those things. But by asking those kinds of questions, you're being systematic about it. Now, not every question's got an answer, at least an answer that can be you can speak about with confidence. But in many cases, and this is where it's a bit more participatory, like I think often good systems theory and thinking is like, what is the reality that you and I and all of us agree to be? And how do we know that? What evaluation does is kind of take that as a challenge to try and figure out how is it the things that we make, the things that we actively produce, what happens? And that's really the distinction also between evaluation and research. Evaluation is a type of research, but what evaluation is doing is taking as its subject matter a thing that's out in the world. It can be a policy, it can be a practice, it can be a product, it can be something like that somebody has designed with a particular intention, sometimes consciously, sometimes unconsciously, and they put it into the world and expecting to produce something. And what evaluators do is ask, well, what happened? What happened and what did it produce? So that's kind of what evaluation is. But what Tara's talking about is like taking that to another step, is like really getting to ask, like, how can I understand more about, if I'm talking about transition, I'm talking from, maybe from what to what? What did I have before? What do I have in the middle? And what do I have at the end? And is that a better option than I had before? I think those are questions worth asking, of course, in my opinion.
Yeah, thanks, Cam. I think you opened up a lot about this fundamental aspect about asking questions, the right questions, and fitness. And I just want, in that spirit, we're a relatively small group. I just want to open it up at this point to see, does that resonate with anyone? Does anyone want to share reflections or thoughts or responses related to this idea of an evaluated mindset? And Cam and Tara unpacked a little bit about the mindset versus the field as well. Yeah, you can raise your hand, and we're a small enough group. When you're called upon, you can unmute and mute. David Ing.
I have this question that's just coming up because it almost sounds like evaluation may be the wrong word. Maybe evaluating may be a better description of what you're trying to do, because it seems to me it's a process that you follow, whereas people just interpret, evaluation, you get to the end and then you're evaluated. So what do you think about that?
Is that, Tara? I don't know. Is that for everybody?
Yeah.
What I would say to that is that evaluation is evaluating, but is also evaluation is, if you think about it from a field, it's that cluster of activities. It's being systematic and asking questions about the thing that you're looking to do. So I do think that it's an active evaluation itself is a set of activities. Evaluating is what you do when you undertake those sets of activities, if you will. So that's I guess what I would say is the distinction between that from linguistically.
I think that's sort of, we had talked about like, is this, what are we going to call this talk? And I think like landing on the idea of a mindset or evaluation mindset or evaluative thinking. I think to me, that's sort of reframing evaluation as evaluating is sort of trying to point at that idea that it is this, it's more processual, I guess, than a thing. And yeah, that's definitely how I am employing it, I guess, when I'm thinking about evaluation. I think it also kind of points to this idea of like evaluation to me often speaks to like a specific thing where there's like a specific project that is about evaluation, where an evaluation is conducted, and evaluating speaks to that as a more of like a capacity and think something that's, yeah, part of all sorts of different practices.
Good old semantics. Wonderful to unpack that. Amy, you have your hand up.
Thank you. A couple of things come to mind. I mean, I just was going to comment on Cameron's comment of like, made me think like you need to know where you're starting from. And as simple as that sounds, I do feel like that tends to also be a problem, because there's all these assumptions that are made and not talked about when you get into creating an evaluation, and then it's almost like you've missed that step. I mean, that's sort of my experience with that. And then I guess the other piece of it is, as you were just saying about like evaluation versus evaluating, it's also like to what end. And I think that evaluation can conjure up this like defensiveness, because it can go into this territory of critically investigate, and what does that mean? And so also I think just like having people understand like, what is the value of evaluation? Why are we doing it? Right. So a couple of thoughts on that.
Absolutely. And if I may just jump in there, Amy, I think that's a great point. And one of the things that often gets missed in a lot of discussion about evaluation is that value is built into the word. Like evaluation is about what we value. And we may value different things. That's fine. But like as a group, we may come together. And I just saw some of the questions also in I'm going to try to answer a couple of other questions there, is the idea about accountability structures. And those are things about what a certain group might value based on, we've set a standard. A group may set a standard and say, this is what we believe is important and trustworthy, and however that is, we're going to match whatever it is that you're doing against that standard. So whoever came up with the standard says, this is what we value. But I think it's also really important to know that that's fine, because that's in that case, it's fit for purpose. But to recognize that other people may value different things. And where evaluation as a collective goes off is that when it starts to assume that everybody's valuing the same thing. And I'm going to define what's important for everybody, instead of going, well, if I'm going to ask a few of you what's important and you all agree, then I could probably say, okay, here's how well something does against that. But if I'm going to assume everybody's got the same sense of value, that's where we get into some real trouble. And that's where I think evaluation makes the mistake, is that you've got to be careful about scoping that sort of thing. Because the truth is that you can take anything and evaluate it in multiple different ways based on whatever audience or group or individual or circumstance value is generated for.
I think that also, I was kind of in thinking about this conversation, I was asking myself, as someone who's not a professional evaluator, I'm like, what is the difference between evaluation and critique, or evaluation and reflection? I think these are, I don't know if I have good answers for these, but I think they are overlapping to an extent. But I do think that it's really like, I think evaluation to me, like I said at the outset, is around this question of effectiveness and whether the things you're doing are effective for kind of the purposes you're striving towards. I think that can be really hard to judge, but I think that's an important part of like a design process where we are iterating. We have to have some way of saying like, oh, is this iteration, how do I improve it? Like you have to judge whether its effectiveness. And so that's an action that's kind of ongoing. And I think that's what I come back to when I'm thinking about the purpose of evaluation. And I also think that evaluations increase our capacity to evaluate, if that makes sense. Like I think that by practicing evaluation, we get better at evaluating. And I think that it's a really important capacity as a kind of systemic designer to hold. So I also think about that kind of meta purpose as well.
Awesome. Dawn, you can unmute and ask your question.
Yes, I can. Yeah, I'm be coming at this from a somewhat different point of view because of recent reading, I guess. Might be more interesting to Cameron actually, because it has a close connection to psychology, but also neuroscience. The models they're seeming to be coming up with now, and is also, by the way, seems to be appearing in other social sciences as well, is that evaluation with a small e is what we constantly do. It's how we assess the world. We do not have accurate recordings in our heads that tell us what's going on. We constantly reconstruct what we think is going on. And to do this, we look at connections among our neural networks that piece together what it seems to be at the moment. So evaluation with a small e is an essential and continuous process. We also have to be humble about it because we may be tapping into the wrong networks. We may be looking at the wrong things. We may have forgotten something because we're too busy thinking about something else. So we have to be constantly consulting with one another. And that, I think, is really important. I mean, we are prediction machines. If we don't predict, we don't know anything. And by the way, then we test it against the world, and that's another aspect of evaluation. That's when it comes out of your brain, I suppose, out of your neural systems and into the shared reality, whatever that might be. So the big E is constantly under fire as well. And I think humility is something we should approach it with, because I think it's very important that we do it, but not take it too seriously and constantly evaluate the evaluating. That's the way I would see it right now, because I've had this hammered into me by a bit of reading I've done in the last few months.
You know, just actually, thanks, Dawn. I appreciate your comments there. I actually think this is I'm actually, I don't have as much to say. I actually would love to hear what Tara has to say on this, because Tara, you brought up the term of critique. And I think, and just my take on critique is that what it can do is help you almost extend your evaluation. Because if I'm evaluating, because you're right, Dawn, I would agree, like we're constantly going, the upside is when you're evaluating for yourself, you're both the best and worst judge in a way of evaluating the fit for purpose, because I think sometimes we don't always know what we know or what's best for us and stuff like that. But what I think critique can do is get us to a point of going, what if I was to take another perspective? What if I was to start asking some questions a little bit more, that evaluating and go, you know, I can go, this is what I like. You know, just my brain might tell me, yep, my nervous system, whatever it is, this feels good to me, or I enjoy it, or it's useful. I don't feel as hungry when I do these things, or whatever that sort of thing is. But what critique can do is kind of step back and go, what else could be going on here? And is my assessment of this situation maybe the most adequate that I could make? Is it the most useful? Is it the most helpful? I don't know, Tara, what your thoughts are when you think about that kind of a thing, circumstance.
Yeah, I mean, I think it kind of makes me think a little bit about, or it makes me reflect on my own experience and practice working in systemic design and how, yeah, I think I mentioned earlier just around this, like everything, all the decisions we're making as a designer or someone taking action in the world are guided by these models that we've created about how the world works. And they're usually implicit, and then we are updating them. But I think what I'm sort of hearing is this call to make that a little bit more explicit and to question how we're kind of developing these models, both of like what the world is, where we're at, and how it changes. And I think that is like in my own practice, I think that's happening. It's usually happening implicitly. That's something that it isn't called into question that much. And I am very, like Cam mentioned earlier, evaluation is systematic. And my way of doing that is not very systematic. It's, there's a lot of, there's a lot of kind of intuition and it's following an evaluation, but it's not systematic. So I'm curious about what that might look like to be more systematic in questioning how we build those models. I'm currently not a good example of it, I would say, but I'm curious about it.
Yeah, that's definitely a thread we can pursue in a second. Helena, you have your hand up. You can unmute.
Yeah, one of the things that strikes me about the whole topic of evaluation is just how broad a topic it is and how it ranges from, say, an audit where everything is agreed ahead of time, what exactly the purpose is and how it's going to be evaluated. And there are very solid criteria for knowing, did the process work to produce the result it was supposed to produce? And that can be done with varying degrees of rigor with both hard and soft information. But then you get to the other end of that, which is the critique and reflection end, where in the audit, you know what the context is. But in reflection and in critique, it seems to me that you're stepping back and you're saying, did we have the right context? Or what other context might be useful to consider how this is going? And ideally in the design process, I would think that would be occurring in stages. So it wouldn't be, you wait till the end and say, did it work or was it a success? But you'd be looking at all along the way, what are the benchmarks? What else should we be considering? What other questions should we be asking? What assumptions are we making? That kind of, much broader area. And I just was wondering how you saw it and whether you saw it as that kind of continuum.
You go ahead if you want.
Okay. I really like that, Lena. I like seeing it as a continuum. I think I'm finding it, at least personally, kind of hard to make some of this distinctions between evaluation and reflection and critique, because I see them as very overlapping. And yeah, I'm curious about what's the variable that's changing along the continuum, I guess. I don't know what that would be, but I do think they're very overlapping. And yeah, I think I kind of sit more in that space of asking those questions, I think, as I go along. I haven't actually really participated in much kind of formal evaluation beyond a project that Cam and I are both supporting. So I do think that that's kind of the space where I dwell, or asking those questions as I go along. Is this the right context? Are these the right questions? Yeah. Cam, you want to go ahead?
Elena, I think you've really touched on like you got it. I think you kind of got where evaluation is. Coming back to the kind of the fit for purpose is that in some cases you do want to have something where you've got a fairly rigid set of constraints. You've got an idea, a set of standards people agree, and a very clear function as to what that's going to do with a very narrow constraint. And an audit, is a very acceptable thing to do if that's what the purpose is there for. But it is true that to ask some questions, and maybe just to give a practical example, a project that Tara and I has started somewhere in the middle, I would say, closer to sort of like from, if you think of one end being really asking those big questions as to what, like what are the questions we could ask versus having a more narrowly prescribed set of boundaries and things like that. We started closer to the middle, a little bit more on the bigger question, but I think over the course of the 2 or 3 years, and I should also mention Griff has been on this project as well, the questions have gotten a little bigger, a little broader, because and just to give you a bit of a context, we've been asking these questions within the context of organizations and initiatives that are trying to support social finance throughout Canada. And the more we started asking questions, the more we started to think about what were kind of the key principles behind this initiative. We start asking questions and people are starting to understand what it all means differently. And as they start understanding things differently, it gets us to think a little bit about, are we asking the right question? So our calibration, our evaluation of the evaluation in a sense is to try and calibrate it to almost the reactions we're getting from those we're engaging with. Like, they're starting to see, that's a more useful question. You know how it is with a lot of inquiry? Like if you can ask a good question, that's almost as good, maybe even better than getting a good answer because it opens up more possibilities. So what we've been able to do is start to ask different questions. And for us, the internal evaluation was in a way a bit of calibration of understanding, like we didn't want to get too far because there was a point at which we were asking bigger and bigger questions of which you could see there's a bit of pushback going, okay, I think that we're getting a little lost here. And yet if we get too narrow, too prescribed, we're also getting feedback going, oh, that's a little too, that's not capturing all the richness of our context. So we had to kind of work together to try and figure out what is the right lens of questioning that we were asking. So that's just to give you an example of building on that very thing. Now we were able to do that in part because we were using an approach called principles-focused evaluation. The principles that we were using to guide us lent themselves to that kind of expansive way of doing things. So I think we were able to do that fairly well. If we had picked a different method or approach, we might not have actually got there.
Ooh, that's another thread, principles-focused evaluation. Where to go? Stephen, I see your invisible hand up, so I'm gonna call your invisible hand, Stephen Sillett.
Thanks. I can't get my video to work, so unfortunately, because I don't know why. But can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Excellent, excellent. Okay, thanks. Yeah, this is excellent. I think, like I say, evaluation is like on a continuum, as was mentioned, and it's interesting as we move into this idea that we're evaluating what kind of policy we're going to select. So, like in a summative evaluation, that's like the policy of do we even continue or repeat the same thing? To do we in developmental, like do we develop, and how do we develop in a more near time context? And I do think that the principles focused is really interesting, the way that's sort of a bit in between, and I'll be interested to hear a bit more about that side of things and how the principles are working out. I do a lot of work with communities where we actually develop our own processes for community participation, immersive theatre type of work, and sort of long-term development, and been really looking at these principles to see what sort of principles underpin working in that way. And I wonder in a way whether this is one last thing, is whether systems thinking is systems basically a tool that we have in our environment to help us evaluate what to do next. I mean, it's basically an evaluation tool for how to understand the world. And at some point, the aim is that you make a choice with it, you know, but it's the idea is it's a bit more agnostic. It's a bit more of a universal research tool rather than at the more nitty-gritty multi-path tool that you might have, you know, but sometimes they are used with systems modeling to sort of inform different contexts, different types of situations. So I'd be interested to hear how, like, the choice between developmental evaluation and principles-focused evaluation sort of plays out when you're going between some of these different scales of working, like in health and community psychology, etc., and how that's been landing for Cameron and the different types of work that Tara's doing as well.
Yeah, maybe I'll just jump in there because you mentioned, yeah, so there's a lot in there, and I think that those are some really important questions. So one of the things is with both developmental and principles focused are owe their heritage to Michael Quinn Patton, who was in some of the advanced readings and that. And Michael is just, I think Michael would probably describe himself as a systems thinker, but that's not his, it would be further down the list of things. He thinks in systems sort of thing. But what developmental evaluation does just at its core, for the people who may not understand, know that, is effectively it's you're assisting people to develop, like, if you will. So for example, and just to use a kind of a maybe crude example, it's not crude in an offensive way, but for example, if you think about developmental psychology, you think about understanding how people are at certain stages of life. So if you took a 5-year-old and you looked at a 5-year-old and you said, what might be the most appropriate developmental markers for a 5-year-old, roughly speaking? So they might, they can probably walk, they probably can interact a little bit with others and that sort of thing. If you took a 30-year-old, you're not going to say a 30-year-old is a 6 times better 5-year-old. Like, that doesn't even make any sense. Like, it makes no, there are developmental markers for when you're 30. You might think, okay, well, can I kind of function on my own? Do I have to be still living with my parents? There's nothing wrong if you're living with your parents, but you're doing it not because you can't survive without that. Normally you're out there kind of getting educated and that sort of stuff. So the idea is that, are you evolving from age 5 onward with some form of usefulness? So developmental evaluations kind of help you evolve in whatever direction you're going into. Principles focused can be a twist on that. So they can be done independently or they can be done together, but effectively what principles do is kind of give you a bit of a touchstone. And the reason why that was selected in part, and I can let Griffin, certainly Tara, respond to this if there's anything I'm missing from that, but one of the challenges that we had was with the circumstances in these programs for social finance in Canada is there isn't a model. There's lots of models for social finance out there in the world and in Canada, but we're talking about a national initiative to build capacity and linkages at the local community, at the almost provincial and national. So there isn't an example. There's lots of sub-examples of pieces, but there isn't one in general. And at the same time we didn't actually know where it was going to develop to. Like, there wasn't a sense of like, aha, if everything goes according to plan, we should end up in this place, because we didn't even know that. And so, but what we did know was that there are directions that consortium, that collaboration can go, which we thought were going to be more advantageous than others. There's already a preset sense of kind of desirability in things, but we didn't know exactly how it was all going to go. So what principles focus does is that, we spend a lot of time thinking about what are the core principles to guide this development. And that's really kind of the key thing, is like, so, and I'm Some of them might be more collaborative. So, you know, we want to have collaboration. We know that we can't have everybody just doing their own thing and expecting it to have some sort of harmony and coherence. We need to have them to communicate. They got to be able to collaborate. So that's a principle. So we think about those things. So really what we did is we set up with a series of principles to serve as our touchstone to sort of go, are we kind of getting into the weeds, or are we evolving into a direction that might be useful? I think in all of that, I'm not sure. I think I've lost a little bit of the question, but just to give you a sense of that, that's how those two things kind of can balance out together.
No, that makes sense. Thanks. Just one question on that is, because you've got this scale thing, that sort of ties in then with that community psychology question of difference. Like there's some limits, isn't there, to the way different levels can be looked at the moment. It's kind of, it's a bit of a crapshoot in a way. I don't know how you guys found that. Like how do you rationalize that from the point of where the principles make sense, you know, like, or these more broader project, like, did you use like an action research approach, which is more project based, or did you do it more like community psychology, which is more about individual impact, or was it something different?
I would say that it was very much collective. In a way, it did both. It was looking at individual areas of you know, because there were certain groups that were looking at more communities of specific communities, whether geographically defined or whether they were, you know, communities of practice or they were communities of interest, those sorts of things. And then also collectively. So we're kind of trying to do a bit of both, because the key thing is we weren't really sure how or whether this was going to add much benefit. So we tried to keep, you know, we didn't try to prescribe things too much with that. But I mean, Tara and Griff, you know, I don't know, Griff, I know this is your thing, but you're welcome to jump in here.
Yeah, I can jump in for a couple minutes and give you guys like a little breather. Yeah, so principles focused evaluation. So typically we're doing that kind of work. And by the way, Cam trained me like 2 years ago. So if I get anything wrong, it's on him. So when we think about principles, like principles inform action choices and therefore actions in a system where like navigation is a little bit tricky for whatever reason. And when we're doing an evaluation of principles, my understanding, at least according to Michael Quinn Patton's like work, is like the first thing is, are the principles clear? Now that on its own is always a little bit interesting because it's like clear to who, clear, and it turns into that evaluative stance. Like we think it's clear. Is it clear to the people we're talking to? And so I like to think of it as, are they clear, understood by the people who need to use them in a way that's agreeable amongst that community, roughly speaking. And then following that, it's like, is this principle actually being followed? Like, are people actually using it? Like, people actually keeping to their word? Cam was often talking about, actually, I'm sort of mixing my Cam and David here, but sort of like attention and intention. You know, what do you intend to do? And it's on your board. You know, we want to be this way, and then we actually put our attention on something that indicates that it doesn't actually match with our intention. So that's the second thing, is like, are you actually following these principles? And then the third thing is like, if you are following these principles, are they leading to a result that you want, the result you desire, you know, for whatever reason? And maybe that result isn't so fixed. Maybe it is sort of like, as Tara was talking about, opening a pathway or creating conditions. It's not necessarily like a fixed number on a board. So I can give you an example to help tie it together. This is a large investment project that the three of us and some others work on. And one of the principles that was handed to us to sort of evaluate in context was around like openness and transparency. And there was this idea that like, when in doubt, be open and transparent. And, you know, as we talk to the community broadly, this is a really interesting thing to be asked to do. One, because sometimes there's like a sense of competitiveness. Maybe you don't want to be totally open. Another, in that there's an amount of effort or like labor or like output involved to make something open and transparent and interpretable by other parties. So there's like an overhead to this kind of process. So if it's desirable and that's what you want, then you need to leave us time to do it. It's not just be open. There's a way you go about doing this. And then another thing that came up was it's really interesting that this kind of principle is given to us by other agencies who, for example, are very closed in the way that they decide how they hand out funding or decide on the rules of the road or X and Y and Z. So it's sort of like a, everyone needs to be open and transparent sort of thing. So this is just like sort of one rough way to give you an illustration of the kinds of feedback you get when you're talking about these principles and you're saying, like, could you be, open and transparent? Are you? Do you feel that you are? Yeah, you start to get those kinds of feedback, and it starts to inform. You can see how, if you are the listening or decision-making or implementation body of that system that I'm describing, and you get that feedback, like you have not been open, that is really interesting and like in some ways like powerful feedback to receive. Yeah, so that's like one way that this sort of thing gets articulated in real life. And it's much broader than that. I'm just giving you like a tiny little slice for interest's sake.
Yeah, thanks. That's really helpful actually, because I've been playing with trying to work out the principles, but I haven't necessarily been able to fully think about trying to evaluate on them. Do you know what I mean? And that's
yeah.
Do you feel like you almost have to have an actor or some agent that's trying to act out those principles that you could then see how they're doing? Does that make sense? Like, this is what the organization's trying to do, or this is what the management's trying to do, or this is what the and it's sort of linked to an actor in some way, or is it not? It doesn't have to be. It could be a bit broader than that. The main thing is it gives you some way of, or it's not just getting the principle. It's about seeing how the principle then gets used. I was just curious because I think that I haven't read as much about. I've read about the principles being found, but not as much about or post, like almost being found after the event. But it's interesting you're saying about trying to then use that almost to help guide, almost coach people, you could argue.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I'm going to let Cam answer that, but to me, it's a very interesting question you're posing, because to me, that there is a choice to be made. Like, implicit in that is that there's a something that is making the choice, and it's whatever that thing is. But maybe it's not like an entity, and in our case it is. It's like organizations, and they're fairly bounded and defined, like more or less. But yeah, Cam, do you know, or Cam or Tara, do you know of like examples of systems or entities that are being evaluated that are not so bounded? Like, does that make sense? Yeah, interesting question.
Well, I was going to use an example, one that's highly bounded actually, but yet the context is an interesting one. So just to use, and I'll just to riff on the idea of open and transparent. So there often is this assumption. It's kind of taken for granted. The idea is, well, increased transparency is a good thing in most cases, particularly say with government. Lots of reasons for that, if you can think about it, particularly if you've ever been, if you're from a country where there's very little transparency, or you've been a member of a marginalized or oppressed group, transparency is a good thing. But one of the interesting things that's happening right now is, if you've noticed, in Canada, we've got an in question period. I don't know if it's the same, how much it is in other countries. There is not just question period. Sorry, there's cameras are now into governmental committees, so you can actually start to see inter-party committees coming together to talk about particular issues. Now, that's where much of government takes place. If you've ever seen them live, you start to see, real discussions about this. But once they started to add cameras in, what you ended up getting was a lot more posturing, because now all of a sudden it was around sound bites. So the idea of actually using it as, instead of when you're away from the crowd, the eyes of the public, you can actually talk to each other as humans. I mean, that's kind of horrible to have to say that we're in a system that's what happens, but they tend to work collaboratively. Well, now all of a sudden it's a place to score points. So in that way, you've actually got a system and an individual stuff coming together there. You've got a system that, the ideal is transparency. You think, well, that kind of makes a lot of sense. But the way individuals are using it is in some ways actually circumventing or actually thwarting the purpose of what that original group was meant to do, ideally. And I think that's an interesting situation here. So what is the answer from a principle standpoint? So this is where, to build on kind of what Griff was introducing in there, is you want to be able to probably use another principle to say, okay, well, maybe transparency's got some limits in this case. I don't know, is it a good idea or is it not? But maybe there's another one. So maybe it's around effectiveness, or maybe it's around utility, or maybe it's around engagement, or it could be anything. Like you might come up with a constellation of principles that, when put together, can both address things at an individual level, but also at a systems level at the same time.
Kara, did you want to add anything before we go on to any other questions?
Yeah, I mean, I think we're going down a principles rabbit hole here, which is kind of nice because that's the only kind of form of evaluation that I know about. But I think I'll just keep it short and say that I think that I think the principles piece, the way that I think about it, is actually an intervention into a system that's meant to kind of change the way that system works and interacts and what it can produce. So I think that by doing an evaluation, I think there's a lot of questions in this context around, like, these principles actually weren't even necessarily known by the people who were a part of it, and they were sort of prescribed. But there's an idea that by following these principles, it'll take you to open up pathways for the kind of things that this group was trying to achieve. And so by doing the evaluation, there's the spreading this idea that these are principles that we might want to follow, which is an intervention into the system as well. So I actually think about them a little bit from that lens as well. Like, principles are, I often think about them as from the lens of prefigurative politics, and taking principles from the kinds of worlds that we want to be prefiguring and using those as principles to guide my work in the present as a way of opening up possibilities for it. And those are things that you can evaluate as well.
Fascinating. Okay, we can continue on with, there's more questions, so that's great. Or not questions, but this is the discussion. David Ing.
I have a question, and this may be just the way that people apply evaluating versus thinking in systems. And I'm thinking in systems in terms of multiple systems and multiple things, multiple features within the system. And the idea that the interesting word that came out to me was standard. And so if you actually establish a good standard, there usually are penalties for reaching the standard. And if it was really good, there would be penalties for overachieving the standard. And so I wonder if some of the confusion or concern comes with, in effect, more is better thinking. So, if you have multiple principles or multiple criteria and you're evaluating across them, do you actually then overachieve, and then the things that you haven't been measuring, you underachieve on? Is that a systems view or something that people think about?
Tara. Yeah, Tara looked like she has a juicy answer, and I don't want to I don't want to jump into.
I don't have a juicy answer if you have one, or if that's just a stalling technique.
Yeah, I don't know if I have one either. I think one of the things though with a principles focused, I mean, it can be whatever thing, if you and those you are looking to use principles focused all agree that these are good principles and you find them useful, then they are. So there's no real objective standard, to use that point. But what I would say is this, is that, there's a sweet spot. So principles tend to work better in more complex systems where you have there isn't really a direction, a specific direction. There's more favorable outcomes and less favorable outcomes, but there's a multitude of outcomes that could potentially work. And so really what you're looking for is generally, it's not even that you even have a principle that's clearly met, but you have a sense of utility. And the link that I provided in the chat has got Michael Quinpan's got this guide framework, and it's really like, does it help guide your decision making? Is it useful? His view is it inspiring? And to me, the designer in me likes that, because ultimately, if you're creating something, you're looking to inspire people. Maybe not blow their mind. Great if you could, but even just you're trying to get them motivated to do something. And because you're talking about complex systems, it's got to be developmental, and it also has to be evaluable. And that maybe, David, is to your point. Like, does a principle have utility? Can it be measured against those things? So, it was useful or not. It was inspiring or it was not. It guided you or it didn't. That sort of thing. In some ways, that's kind of the standard that you would hold your principles against. And in a way, that would tell you if you've got enough of them or you've got too many.
Awesome. I think there's still a lot more that can be said on that. But I noticed in the chat, Natalia actually had a question. And so welcome, Natalia. And if you're able to, you can unmute and maybe share your question.
Thanks for the presentation and the discussion so far. The first part of the question was more to make sure that I had understanding that the principles are used as a way of helping to frame the approach, which then leads you to understanding how to evaluate the system. So it's the first step, almost the ontological step. And then who is invited to clarify the principles, if so? Is it those that are being evaluated? Is it the ones that are being impacted? How broad does that process of designing the principles become?
Sarah, Cam?
Yeah, I think it depends on the context. Like if we're taking this out of the one example that we've been talking about, the one project we've been talking about, I think it really depends on the context in which principles are being applied. I think that the example that we've been talking about is an interesting one because it's kind of talked about as an ecosystem in the sense that there's like a lot of it's unclear what the boundary is around it. It's unclear who's participating in it. It's unclear. So like it's kind of not it's not like a clear network, I would say, of who might be following the principles or who should be following the principles. So I think that's a strange context. I think that principles also, like, I think about them also in just a personal context and like what principles are guiding my design practice. And so that's a very different context where it's about me. So I think that your questions, Natalia, really depend on the kind of scale at which these evaluations are taking place. I don't know if that is answering any of those questions. That was just the first thing that came to mind, is like, these look very different in different contexts. Cam, I don't know if you have any thoughts.
Yeah, I would say I think that's that's a great answer. I mean, I think that it really does depend on the context. I mean, I hate to do the old "it depends" academic style answer, but in some ways it really does. But what I would say is that in you can be very, if it comes down to sort of asking what you want the principals to do. Almost think about like a design question. Is it meant to be, an intentional act of inclusiveness? So in which case, involving people, everybody involved or different groups involved, or is it meant to help clarify things? Like if you're in an area of deep uncertainty about what the right questions are, what the right approach is, right, everything like that, you may want to involve people that are involved in this particular initiative because you just don't know. So you can do it intentionally as an act of inclusion. You can do it as a way of gathering valuable information. But you also want to think a little bit, just a little point to think about, is that what's the stake or interest of people involved? Because in many cases, people might be involved in an evaluation. They don't really have a deep interest in it. It's okay. It's okay if people just aren't, if they may not really feel that like I need to engage with these kinds of principles. I'm just generally interested in providing information. So there's no really one right answer. It sort of depends on what you want those principles to do and what enacting them and engaging people with them, what do you hope to accomplish through them?
Feels like we're about to get into the evaluating the Q&As right now. So then Natalia, maybe you have a follow-up.
Yeah, thank you. Because my follow-up was going to be, when do you take more of that principle-based approach? Because it sounds like the initial framing is necessary if there's more complexity. But if you're facing a situation where it's framed as being a very simple, more complicated challenge, where a straightforward evaluation would be helpful, might that be excluding certain frames of reference or narratives around what ought to be getting evaluated and what isn't being evaluated? And then how does that conversation take place to then bring things back to, should we have taken a principle-based approach to begin with?
I would say just to that answer is a lot of that comes down to values, is like what's important to those who are involved in being able to do that. I don't know if there's necessarily even one time, but it's a case of, are we doing things without people that we feel that should be here, be part of the conversation? That's a values question, not so much even a principles question. You can set your principles up to reflect those values, but to me, that's much more of a values question. And there's a lot of stuff has been done in the name of evaluation where we have not included people that really need to be included, particularly if we're thinking about things like power dynamics, when we're thinking about understanding context, and when we're thinking about how evaluations are being used. So if it's somebody who's coming from an outside perspective, you've got to be extra sensitive to make sure that it's not just you're imposing a set of values and beliefs and systems on top of people. But if it's a more participatory thing, I mean, it does kind of just depend on who's doing the evaluation, for what purpose, and what questions is it asking of particular groups and settings and contexts. I know that's a lot of context, but that kind of will determine when and how you might use it. There really isn't one particular way, but you just want to be always extra sensitive to the idea of just understanding is there somebody who should be at the table for whom what I'm about to what I'm gathering, like the information I'm gathering and whatever assessments I'm making or judgments I'm coming up with, do they need to be here? Should they be here? And how do I get them involved?
Thank you.
I'm gonna entertain or field or throw a question myself, actually. Oh, Kelly. Okay, I have to oblige Kelly before I do that. Right in time,
No,
Kelly.
you can go first.
Okay. Thank you, Kelly. Something, I'm going to go rewind the tape a little bit, going back to something Tara mentioned much earlier, and I'm going to direct it in a sort. I'm going to dramatize the nuance, Cam, and I'm going to dramatize the confusion. I don't have it, but I'm going to go into character. And Tara, you can also chip in if the question is not clarified. But and I'm going to synthesize a couple of pieces together on the continuum and the different roles that evaluation can have. Sounds like there's a type of mode of evaluation that comes for evaluating effectiveness. We've done this amount of activities, and we want to evaluate how effective we were in accomplishing it, X, Y, Z. And then somehow, it sounds like there's an evaluation that also says, let's evaluate our values in a shared reality and create a direction of where we want to go. And perhaps the challenger question is, how can it be both? How can this, how does it operate on these different levels? Is that coherent? Is there a consistency between them? So I'm dramatizing the question, but maybe that's just something that occurred to me that might be useful to share out.
That's a great question, and it really is. And Tara, this may resonate with your work, your other work. But one example that comes to mind is conservation efforts. So the effectiveness is like, let's say, for example, we're looking to protect salmon fisheries. We have historical data that says, typically speaking, this is how many salmon are likely to come into this area. We have a certain amount of that are caught and all these other things. So you've got all that sort of data historically. In some cases, if you're looking from using real world data, you could actually have it for hundreds of years, of data. And you start to notice that there's a precipitous decline for a variety of reasons. So one of the things you may want to do is that, say, for example, it has to do with overfishing. I'm just going to pick a cause because so we can draw some sort of connection. Is you may say, okay, we're going to come up with enact a series of measures that we think is going to control this. So that might mean changing the window of fishing, changing the quotas. It could be a whole group of those sorts of things. So you could do that. So that's one part, the effectiveness. But the other question about the asking the bigger kind of question is, you could do that at the same time. You could also sit back and say, is this, in terms of our conservation efforts, is this the best route to go? So we have a finite number of resources and things like that. There are a number of ecological factors that are affecting the salmon, of which we only control some. So for example, if you've got warming water, there's not much you can do. I mean, whether you want to argue collectively, maybe we can, but there's a number of different factors we can't. So there is conversations right now in the conservation community, is this the best use of our energy? Or should we think about something else? I'm not saying let all the salmon go, but you see what I mean? You can have that tension between, is this a useful strategy? Because it comes down to a couple of questions. Is the goal the salmon, or is the goal what the salmon represent? And that's an interesting question. And you can really struggle with that one, because you can sit back and say, well, yes, it is salmon because they provide a food source, and there's cultural significance to them and all that sort of stuff. But you could also say, what do they represent? They represent the health of an ecosystem. So in some cases, are there other things we can do that may be more effective at promoting the health of an ecosystem than spending this amount of time, focus, energy, whatever that is, on controlling overfishing? I don't have answers for any of those questions, I should tell you, or a stake in that. But just to give you an example of how evaluation can be used on both of those things, and then certainly to use the conservation, I work with a few people that are in that sector, is those are the things they struggle with.
Mm-hmm. Maybe I'll just play back my own characterization of what you've described, which is, on one hand, the effectiveness one could be systematic in its effort and its approach, etc. But the one where you go upstream, pun intended, is systemic in the sense that it's systemic, and it's like also systemic strategic, like you're also thinking about the broader context of where you go. So I'm just reflecting on that as characteristics, perhaps. But I don't know, Tara, this question originated in your mind, and I've kept it when you shared it earlier. I don't know if you want to respond or react to what Cam's responded to.
Yeah, I think, I mean, a bunch of stuff kind of comes up for me in response to this. I think one is just, I think that we can kind of come to value, like Cam was saying, like, is that the thing or is it something else? And I think that same with like being a designer working in systems, we're often designing something that's in service of something greater, but we can get really caught up in that thing and think that that is the goal. And I think it's the same for values. Like there's like we might come to value a step as sort of the end. And so I think that that's where those questions get tied up for me, is around thinking through those, like, what is it that we're valuing and why, and evaluating our models for thinking about those steps as well. And I think that ultimately there's probably a lot of resonance around those kind of like the deeper values, the deeper desires, and evaluation is a really interesting tool to think about, like how we have debates around, or how we deliberate around the pathways of moving towards those things. So that's kind of what comes up for me in response to Cam.
Yeah. And I think from that perspective, you can start to really appreciate the reflective nature of evaluative thinking on these levels. It's inherently reflective. Kelly, thank you for obliging me to ask the question, but yeah, go for it.
Come on, yours was probably smarter than mine. I'm going to be really dumb. Take us down a different pathway here. I really appreciate this conversation with regards to evaluations from a systems perspective. And when we're talking about audits in particular, evaluation in terms of a triple bottom line considerations is just so much wider than what we used to do in the past. And how have you found your work? I mean, I know that when I talk to young people, something like going into accounting has a different reference point in terms of how you would evaluate the success of a product or a design of a system or something that's quite different than it was 10 years ago even. So if anybody had any thoughts on that, in terms of just that we're still in this transition stage of, we have policies in place that have had bad implications. Like, for example, offshore production. It was driven by profits, but the implications that you can't dump the pollution here, but we can dump it in some other country's backyard, was one of those policies that are still in place.
Thanks for your question, Kelly. I think, yeah, I guess I'm going to take kind of like a bit of a bigger frame on that. And I think the question for me is, like, I'm sure some of you are familiar with 3 Horizons as a framework, which is basically kind of a framework for thinking about transition in a system where there's sort of a dominant system that's very prevalent, and then a future system that we want to move towards that's not that prevalent, and then a second horizon, which is sort of like the transition between the two, and they all kind of coexist. And I think 3 Horizons asked this really interesting question about the second horizon, like innovations and experiments that are happening in the second horizon. Are they going to be absorbed by the first horizon and end up just kind of propping it up and actually just strengthening this is the status quo, or are they helping move towards a third horizon? So I think that's just another way that I'm thinking about these questions, and like how you make those judgments. That's kind of, I want to like throw that back to systems thinking in a way. I think, Stephen, you asked that question too, is systems thinking kind of a tool for evaluation? And I think that's where I kind of put it back to all of you. I think what tools are there, what ways of thinking are there in systems thinking that helps discern whether an action that we're taking is kind of propping up the first horizon or moving towards the third.
Thank you.
So, David, did you have an answer or did you want me to go on? Sorry, David, go ahead.
No. So I actually would respond to Tara's question, because this is the part when in the system changes learning work that we're doing, and we haven't been doing it to the full extent because we look at rhythms, but there are multiple rhythms that are at play here. So the question is what time horizon you're working in, and whether you can, as Tara says, if you take the short horizon, the short duration, short rhythm, are you going to get to the long rhythm that you would like to get to? And that's a complicated thing that we actually haven't got enough practice on yet.
So,
Can I
sorry,
chip in on that? That's a good.
Go
Could
ahead,
I chip
Stephen.
in on that? Because yeah, there's a. Sorry, I'm having a bit of trouble because I'm on my phone, but yeah, I think it's a really good point, and I think like David said, there's different scales at play, and actually, the three horizons could be quite a useful way to think about the way evaluation works, in the sense that, like, the more traditional way that, like, I had a bad experience the very first time we did developmental evaluation, actually, because the people you don't really want to do a developmental evaluation are evaluators, funny enough, because it's actually the opposite of evaluation in the traditional sense. So it's like the idea of a summative, like you have a project and everyone used to fly out to places in Africa and basically evaluate with that, how good or bad was it, right? Because the idea is basically horizon number one being, it's like, okay, we've got horizon number one in terms of the method or the project. We're sticking to horizon number one. We're going to basically tell you whether it's good or bad, and you carry on doing it. And then in some other way, or in some other kind of change metric, there's a horizon number two. But horizon number 2 and 3 are supposedly what's happening in the community, but not necessarily what's going to happen in terms of changing the program. Because the idea is the program is good or bad, and it's like you're going to keep it going and you're not. But if you're doing developmental or principles focused, the idea is that it's more contextual, it's more nuanced, and either with developmental, you've got to work out what's going to be emerging, if it's even what's the best stab that we can have at keeping this to work in this context, or like principles is a bit more trying to navigate in set of principles. So that becomes more in her. Well, I think it's quite useful to think about the evaluation, the program, and the change, all three on those horizons. Could be that the change isn't even there yet. Maybe you're just trying to work out, can we even get a program that's viable to work to make a change, just to be able to start doing something in the horizon 1 of the issue. But we need to get to a horizon 3 of the capacity to implement. So it's actually quite interesting. So I just thought I'd chip in on that.
Thank you, Stephen. Tara, Cam, did you want to go on that further or yeah? If not, I was just going to say, is there anyone, but sorry, Don, I can see your hand up. Before I go to you, I just want to ask, there's a lot of questions, especially recently, which has been a wonderful, wonderful discussion. If there's anyone who hasn't had a chance to ask the question, especially in the more recent stages, let me know. And I see now, Michelle, you have a question, or I'm not sure if it's a reflection. Did you want to hop on the mic, or did you want me to read that out?
Hi, I'll hop on the mic for a moment. I mentioned before that I come from the world of public health, which is very reductionist in its approach, though we morally or value-based in terms of the betterment of the health of all, but we still measure it with data, and we still measure it analytically. So how do you reconcile someone like me in public health who might want to use value, as you're speaking, value-based evaluation, when our outcome evaluation all revolves around the results of data?
That's a great question, Michelle. And I guess my answer to that one is really it comes like and I'll speak to Tara's language as well. It's how you design it. It's all in the setup. It really is. Like you can always do a values-based interpretation of data that you get. That's always an option. But it's a lot harder if you're asked, it's one thing to say, oh, we don't have we didn't ask the questions that have certain values attached to them, so we know that we can't make statements based on something. Well, that doesn't help you. You'd rather have got the data at the beginning. But I guess what I would just simply say is that, the outcome evaluation is outcomes in themselves there's not a lot of stuff that actually is explicitly good or bad or useful or not. It really comes down to start defining what does, for example, and public health is a great example. What does a positive public health intervention look like? You can make a case using evidence to say that, for example, it can involve things like knowledge, the old knowledge, skills, behavior, all of those sorts of things can all be outcomes. You can have health outcomes for whom and under what condition. So all of those can be contributed to with data. But the key thing is you've got to be able to ask the questions in advance. So if you're ever looking at for example, a change initiative, one of the things that I find a little frustrating is a lot of times people talk about change, but they don't do some variation of a pre and post. And I'm not talking about doing just rigid quantitative measurement, but what it does mean is that you need to know what's happening now and then what's going to happen afterwards as a result of things. Retrospectives you can do it if you've got no choice, you can do retrospectives, but there's always problems with that. Our memories are funny. Like, we forget. Don, you were talking about that earlier. Like our perceptions are a little off, and I'm not sure I'd want to that's not very systematic, if you will. So but even if it's just storytelling, how does the story change over time? So it doesn't have to be quantitative. Like that data could be stories. It could be a mixed method. There's all kinds of things that you can do, but it's just, you want to make sure that you set that up, in advance. And I think part of the problem that public health has had, and I'm overgeneralizing here, so keep that in mind, but is that a lot of times they want to retroactively apply values to data that was never designed to reflect certain values, but people are trying to ad hoc, trying to figure out what that means. I don't think that does us any good. I think you just need to set it up from the very beginning.
Excellent.
I'm just going to add an example, I think. So I like this question a lot, and I think that we can choose to measure what we value, and that's kind of part of designing an evaluation. And I think in a systems context, I've sort of alluded to this before, but we're often designing for these things that are not quite the full thing. They're ingredients, seeds, whatever metaphor you want to use. And I think that's something that you can, I'm often thinking about relationships as a thing that I'm designing for and I working in ecosystems and networks. I'm thinking about relationships and how do I kind of increase relationships or increase the quality of relationships across a network. And so that's an in-between step that I'm working on that I think will lead to other things, but it's something that I can also measure. I can think about how many conversations have I been able to set up? How many people were able to meet each other? I can also measure the quality of relationships as well in various ways. So I think that's something that kind of gets back to Cam's point about it kind of comes back to the design and what we're choosing to pay attention to.
Beautiful. Well said. We are just at 8:20, so Don, we're going to be winding down, but so I'll just ask you, Don, if you want to maybe ask the question in its compressed format.
I'll try to compress it as much as possible. There are a couple of things I think we need to be looking at, from my reading, I guess, are important. When it comes to inclusion, which is something we're basically skirting around here, this is important to do. Inclusion should be not just, how should I put it, people who are demographically or ethnically or geographically diverse, but also who are different levels of development and of maturity, if you wish. This is really important, and just variety of opinion. This is one of the things that seems to get left out. And you wind up with what is called the so-called stakeholders, which is probably a handful. And there are many, many others out there who are not going to be noticed, who might have some really important, innovative ideas to add. That's the one point I'd like to make. The second one, and I'll leave it at this, is in many ways, the system is working exactly the way it was designed to work. To provide privileges to people who certain people think deserve privileges, and to ignore, to a large extent, and healthcare is a perfect example of that, to ignore the needs of a lot of people, or simply lower them so far down the priority list that they don't get the attention they need. I live in Ontario, right? And I see a lot of this working in our system right now. And if we don't look at those really ugly aspects, although there's some hope in there too, if we do look at them, and that's the way I would like to see systems applied, we're not going to get ahead very quickly.
Thank you, Don.
Okay.
Tara, Cam, any in your response to Don, you can feel free to summarize any reflective thoughts, and I would just add maybe even the question of what can systems thinkers learn from evaluative mindset, and then we'll end it there.
I'll unmute and assume that I can put some thoughts together in that time. Don, I think that's a really interesting question, and it makes me think a little bit about a question Natalia was asking earlier too, about like when does principles focused evaluation make sense, or what, by choosing another evaluation, what are you leaving out? And I think there's there's a lot of like, what does it mean to do an evaluation? Usually there's questions I have about like, who is there to listen to it, and what are they open to hearing? I think that if we're thinking about like people who are, managing a system, if that's even a appropriate term to use, like, I don't know, I would be asking those questions, like what are they open to hearing? I think that a lot of evaluation, like the way that we're thinking, or I'm thinking about it as this more of kind of a capacity that bleeds into reflection and critique, is that it's something that you're doing. It might take place outside of that kind of traditional evaluation context, in which case I think that these are questions that we can all be asking ourselves around, like, is this system actually doing what I want it to be doing, and what is it that I want it to be doing? Those are questions that we can ask ourselves. Whether or not we have kind of the control or agency to influence it is another one. But I do think it really depends on who's asking the question. I don't know, Zad, what was your question about closing remarks? What's the question I should be thinking about?
You can come back to it, or I was just saying, if you wanted to embed the title of this session in your response, what consistent, like if you have a 30-second.
Yeah, I think my 30-second piece is really, I'm really curious about it, kind of the other direction, like how can I use systems thinking, or an understanding of how systems work in how in my evaluative thinking? Like, how do I, going back to my questions about like discerning, is this something that props up the dominant system or opens up possibilities for future systems? What are those seeds and steps? I think that my question is really the other way around. So I'm just going to leave it there. Pass it to you, Cam.
A true SFI questioning the question. I love it.
Yeah, that is good. So Don, yeah, I think I can actually maybe I think I can swing these together because of just by chance that Don, your question I think hits that perfectly. So just like if you think about systems thinking, is that some of the things that we are often thinking about boundary conditions. So what is the system? And I think the same thing goes true for evaluation in a way. If you think about like a exercise I sometimes used when I was teaching was who's a member. So if we think about OCAD, because I know there's a few graduates or not a few students or people who are in that orbit, I'll just pick that as an example. So who is OCAD? Well, you could sit back and use a variety of different boundary conditions. You could say, well, it's current students. Okay. Do you include faculty? So you have a discussion to go, well, maybe. Do you include staff? Okay. Is it all staff? Like, are the people who are doing the maintenance in the building or the janitorial staff, do they get included? What about alumni? What about community partners? What about donors? What about stakeholders? So and just like evaluation, which is ironic because you're in a field that often gets assessed, gets viewed as judgment on things, but is that there's no right or wrong answer to those things, but it depends on how you define it. So if your values and if your belief system says, well, we see a university as more of a community, well, then the answer is, well, we might need to have a lens that's a bit more encompassing of that community rather than something very narrow. It's just students and teachers, if you will. So whichever choices that you make, and I think for what does a evaluative mindset is that exact same thing, is that asking, what do I include? And how do those things relate to one another? And then how do those things fit the goals and values that I or we or whomever is developing and stewarding this evaluation, what's most important to us? So I think if you can connect those things together, it really is evaluative thinking and systems thinking are very much aligned. And just like you would in systems, you'd apply a lens of theory, models, tools to help you understand the dynamics of that system or the boundaries of that system, or all the many things that get talked about at Systems Thinking Ontario. Is that same thing you do with evaluation. What are the methods and tools and approaches that we'd use to help understand what's going on in the system?
Thank you, Cam, for such a poetic synthesis of tying all these threads together. And thank you, Tara and Cam, so much. I think with that, we'll bring it to a close. We really appreciate both of you being here. That was Systems Thinking Ontario number 118. Thank you also everyone who participated in the wonderful discussions and all the questions, lively, rich questions and conversations. So with that, we'll call it a night. The next one is going to be March 18th. And we'll send the details out about that. But yeah, with that said, thank you once again and have a wonderful night, everyone. Take care.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thanks, everyone.